So this might or might not be a real infrastructure issue. The infrastructure of bringing water down from Bali is no problem. Bali gets plenty of rainfall. Bali collects a lot of water up here in the northern area. This flows through rivers and is collected over here in this area near Kuta. And then from there, it can be distributed down. All right, welcome again to Market Insights by Jing. I'm here in California today, back in where I was originally born, but I'm speaking hopefully intelligently about Bali market insights from here in this position. Now, recently we've realized that there's been a shortage of good questions to actually answer on market insights. So the team at Book Vista has gone through and done a little bit of research. So they plugged in first of all, they went to ChatGPT and they went through this new part where you can do deep research. And so through this deep research, what they've been able to do is to collect some of the most pressing and difficult questions found anywhere on the internet and assemble them and put in front of me to try to answer right now. So I'm going against an AI now to try to answer essentially what are some of the most difficult and complex questions to answer about the Bali property and tourism marketplace. Now, I've had to do some research to actually be able to answer these questions really well, but we'll start one at a time. The first question is something I'm sure that's on everybody's mind. It's related to the infrastructure development that we see here in Bali. The question is, how does overtourism influence Bali's infrastructure, and how might this influence long-term property investments? I have actually a pretty interesting piece of data that I'd like to show everybody to talk about a general trend and an insight that I've seen during my 20 years in Bali. I have this memo right here. Let's go over here to take a look at it and see what it is, right? We can probably share a screen later on this, but I have a letter over here on this screen, and it's pretty interesting. It's an international bank for reconstruction and development, and this was issued as an executive order from Washington, D.C. and the World Bank, and it was done in June 6, 1974. And so the World Bank in 1974 issued $48 million for Indonesian railways to be constructed, and it issued $6.5 million to develop Indonesian fisheries, and then, surprisingly enough, it issued $15 million to be developed for Indonesian tourism. Now, what was essentially happening at the time that led to this particular progression of developing these funds from the World Bank in Bali? I'll go back to the infrastructure part and try to connect the dots. In my first years, when I first came to Indonesia, my very first trip to Bali, I was actually stunned at how well developed the infrastructure was. And I'll tell you why. So my first trip to Indonesia was in 2004, whereupon I arrived just about a week after the second Bali bomb. This was a terrorist act that was essentially spread. This was the second time that a major terrorist act had affected Bali. What had happened was a sequence of bombs had blown up near the American consulate, some in Jimbaran Beach, another one in Kuta. But what had happened was essentially all the appetite all of a sudden for going to Bali had evaporated overnight. So I was on an Cathay Pacific All Asia Pass where I got to experience 16 different locations across Asia. And my final stop was in Bali, so I had to go through Bali in order to fly back to California. So this is what happened that was pretty interesting. I had the entire jumbo jet from curtain to curtain all to myself. And number one, I was rather surprised that there were jumbo jets going to Bali. Previous island destinations I had gone to had been accessible through smaller, more compact jets. I was relatively surprised that Bali would be able to even receive something of this sort of an international heavyweight jumbo jet. And then when I got to Bali, I realized that the airport was fairly large. It was not a small, simple airport like Koh Samui or other the small islands in Thailand, perhaps Fiji, or even Maui in Hawaii, which was also a small airport. This was a fairly large airport. I left the airport. I was shocked that there was highways in Bali. I was shocked that there was 6 lanes of highways going from the airport to Nusa Dua and then up to Kuta and Seminyak. So in regards to the actual picture of infrastructure, this is one consistent thing that we've seen. The planned infrastructure for Bali has always been quite well designed. If you don't believe me, then all you need to do is actually to go ahead and take a look at the map of Bali. And what you'll find is that if you go to Bali and you go directly from the airport to the one region in which the actual area for tourism was designated here in Nusa Dua, you'll find that there's actually no potential at all for any traffic. And that's because as soon as you arrive to the airport, you have an uninterrupted passageway that has a bypass, essentially, every particular, there's nothing to turn on this side, so there's no obstructions. You can get yourself over to Nusa Dua, no problem at all. So what happened? What's strange about living in Indonesia is this. Whenever there is a plan for infrastructure, nobody really goes there to develop. And whenever there is no plan for any development, that's where everybody goes to develop. So what do we mean by that? Dua was probably the first and most successful large-scale project in Bali, but this was done back like in the 60s and 70s, right? So over along this coastline, as you'll see, numerous hotels decided to build up, and they attained management contracts from all these different Western and European hotels, such as Hilton, Hyatt, Club Med, some Spanish brands in there, Sofitel, of course, Accor properties. So they developed very well over on this side, and everything went very smoothly. But over time, what happened was that they got into a bit of a monopoly, and then the rates were what? International rates, charging, let's say, the equivalent to $300 to $500 a night, similar to prices of what you would experience in North America, Europe, anywhere international. But this, come on, this is Bali, this is Indonesia, this is a developing nation. Outside, people, they live for almost what a guest would live for in a day. They live for a month on the same salary. So inevitably, what you keep on seeing in Bali, and this is the conundrum that essentially the government, businesses, and everybody still haven't worked out yet, is that the spread of development went elsewhere. The spread of development went over to Kuta, then to Seminyak, then to Canggu, and then to Ubud as well. Now, all of these particular areas have never really been designated as primary tourism destinations. So therefore, over time, they have been essentially, you would call, overdeveloped. And I'll explain why that happens and how that happens too very clearly. What happens is usually an innovation. And it's not a bad thing to have innovations, especially in developing countries. It's considered a good thing. But what happens next is that it's a little bit like a tragedy of the commons, race to the bottom. Nobody wants to clean up of the party. Everybody just wants to go to the party. So in each particular case, in Kuta and Seminyak and Canggu, what happened was essentially somebody figured out a new way to draw tourists to their part of Bali. And by doing so, what they were doing was they would build accommodations, they build social infrastructure, and they build all the endpoints of what was a perfect guest experience. So you would build the hotel first, and then you would think about the road. You would build the, let's say, the swimming pool first, and then you'd think about how to get the water actually into it. So the challenge and the problem over time was how would that infrastructure ever keep up with this particular amount of growth? And the answer is it hasn't been able to. It hasn't been able to because the endpoint growth has always exceeded the supporting growth that actually leads to the endpoints. So Canggu is a pretty good example of how growth went a little bit too quickly. Canggu grew primarily because of the advent of internet and mobile travel options. So what happened was this. Essentially, the internet cycle of positive feedback happens much faster than any other type of positive feedback cycle in the world. If you currently use a mobile app to make any particular decisions about who you date, where you buy food, how to get transportation, how you find a house, how you find a job, then you probably already know what I mean. This particular adoption of mobile applications to actually make decisions extremely accelerated the progression of Canggu. And we all know what these mobile apps were. They were essentially Airbnb, Traveloka, Booking.com, Agoda. So these became essentially very positive flywheel effects that led to the super growth of regions like Canggu. Now, Canggu is, come on, let's face it. If you go and you want to understand what Canggu is, all you have to do is to go out west and you see what a traditional Balinese rice farming village looks like. And let's be honest, a rice farming village is not a place that is built up to take industrial capacity for traffic. It's not a place that has ready to take industrial capacity for construction. It is just a simple place that is beautiful to look at, very tranquil, very pastoral, moves like maybe a few bushels of rice a day out on motorbikes. But now instead of actually having the right infrastructure for that, we have essentially overloaded a village infrastructure for what is essentially a city. This leads to further complications of now that infrastructure is following after development, what are we prepared to demolish in order to improve the infrastructure? Do we need to demolish all the existing roads and make them wider? Good luck with that. That's a political challenge. And anybody who's willing to essentially give back their land for the benefit of all the people in the community, well, that's going to be a challenging ask, okay? Number two, should you install more electricity, more Wi-Fi? These are also being done as quickly as possible in an ad hoc way. If you've ever seen blackouts or essentially Wi-Fi coverage go on and off, you see these guys with collapsible ladders in the back of their motorbike. They're doing their best to actually keep up with the growth of also the, let's say, the electricity and also the information needs of the population, all right? But the most critical ones now do not actually recur to, let's say, electricity and Wi-Fi. Those pieces of infrastructure are surprisingly getting more and more superior to even options here in North America. Over here, I am using a cable coaxial internet, whereas in Bali, the common default standard is actually fiber optic Wi-Fi. The two most critical problems that we see throughout the area are, number one, water. Water is a big constraint in the southern part of Bali, especially on the limestone plateau called the Bukit. That's this entire area that is south of the airport. Now, this entire area has been geologically formed over eons. It's been pushed out of the ocean. It's a big limestone coral plateau. So people have been actually mining this coral and bringing it over here up here to Canggu for quite some time to actually give a stable foundation to the rice paddies, which are all mud. And so they use the compressible, highly condensed blocks of limestone to actually produce foundations for villas. But as a result also of limestone, it's not a very good retainer of water. And so as a result, also, there's no hills and no mountains here. So there's no way for, let's say, mountains to capture water and bring rivers here. This part of Bali is extremely dry. So the primary way in which people try to access water is they try to drill down to the limestone and then tap into pockets of water that they can find, but it's expensive and it's not always a hit. The other really terrible way is this, actually. So there are actually pipelines of water coming to this area, but unfortunately, there is a water cartel that watches over the distribution of water in this area. So what do? This water cartel has been essentially haunting the southern part of Bali for quite some time now. I know about them because I used to work at Amman, and we were building a hotel over here in Nusa Dua, and our MEP engineers, that's the mechanical, electrical, plumbing engineers, talked about eons of problems that they had dealing with the little water cartels along the southern coast. So when they were building hotels all along this way, what the little water cartels would do is that they would always disrupt the flow of water by puncturing water pipes along the route as the government was trying to bring pipes in. Why would they do that, you ask? Because they controlled the trucks that then brought in the water. And so as long as the trucks were bringing in water, the trucks were able to pay off and essentially gain control over this area. So this might or might not be a real infrastructure issue. The infrastructure of bringing water down from Bali is no problem. Bali gets plenty of rainfall. Bali collects a lot of water up here in the northern area. This flows through rivers and is collected over here in this area near Kuta. And then from there, it can be distributed down. But there is no cooperation between the local inhabitants who control the water supply and what the provincial government is actually intending. This is an unfortunate consequence, not of infrastructure, but of, let's just say, bad cooperation between the global and the local politics here in Bali. So that's a constraint, but it's probably a fixable constraint. The other constraint is related to congestion and traffic. So we can zoom in over here on this particular graph and take a look at it, or I could probably even use this as, I could probably bring up a 3D map and we can take a look at this, right? So I'm going to show a 3D spatial map of Bali, and it's based on essentially data that we've gathered across on Airbnb that gives us an idea of the density of popular spots across Bali. So what you'll see here, if I can bring up this map in a second, is this. Bam. All right, we're taking a look and we're looking at all the density of different spots in terms of their popularity going from the airport north to other regions. Here's Kuta, Seminyak, and Canggu. what you'll notice is this particular pattern. It's very fascinating, in fact. The pattern is this. The pattern is that as time moves along, you're going to see more and more popular areas along the coastline. Those are the first regions that usually get the first tourists, and they will vote up those places, and you'll see tall green bars in terms of favorable reviews and satisfaction. But what's interesting is this is a pattern we've been noticing every year, that instead of actually seeing a progression of green bars along the coastline further up to the west, you see right here is where it ends. Right here, essentially along the line of Purinat, is where fewer people are actually expanding to the west, which is what you would normally expect, but more are actually expanding and turning inland. This is Tumpuk Bayou, which is a new area that's a little bit east of Canggu. So what this pattern starts looking like is this starts looking like actually a city. It's a localized region instead of a linear region. And I'll show you what a linear region looks like, okay? A linear region looks more like here. This is Sonora. As you can see here in Sonora, most of the activity, Sonora has far less vacation rentals than over in Kuta, Semek, and Canggu. But what you see here is also something fairly interesting. You see a lot less actual movement inland. That's because most people who, when they visit, let's say a beach town community, they want to be within walking distance to the beach. So therefore, most of the development and the popular regions will be closer to the beach. You get some exceptions like these over here, but that's normal. So you develop this way. Now, what does that say about the infrastructure here in Canggu? It says that essentially our hypothesis is that the congestion going this way has now made it unfavorable to develop any further west. Why would that be a problem? Because the danger is if you move any further west, then all of these people who are below you to the airport only add more traffic to your guest who is trying to get to your region, all right? So if you're located way out here, your arrival times might start going from 2 hours to 4 hours to 5 hours to who knows, right? As essentially more and more development is built up here, the actual possibility of this affecting an arrival time to a property further west just gets greater and greater, as you can see. So this is another taxing infrastructure that is specific to, let's say, this part of Semek and Canggu. What about Ubud? What seems to actually be the most balanced and well-managed region that I've seen here in Bali, and it's probably because there is a strong culture of sustainability, there's a strong culture of being aware, and there's a strong, let's say, definition of what is allowable, what is not allowable. Ubud, for example, doesn't have McDonald's. It has very few department stores. Ubud, for the most part, keeps its particular direction as an area that encourages small and medium-sized businesses. I know this because I know the Starbucks, which is right outside the palace in Ubud, had to plea on hands and knees in order to get, let's say, the permission to open a Starbucks so close to the center of the palace. You'll see that there is not so much a, let's say, a accumulation of large businesses there, and that has actually a few really good effects on infrastructure. Number one, it keeps the ability for a single player, let's say a large hotel or a large employer, from getting too powerful and then being able to change the politics, to change essentially the rules in the landscape. So that part is working pretty well for Ubud. The second thing is I think Ubud is still, for more or less, a lot of the land is owned by the royal family. And they are quite good at essentially maintaining the long-term vision of what they want their community to be like. So we see that because we see trails such as the Champawan Trail. This is a really interesting opportunity. I think this speaks a lot to the long-term vision of Ubud. So this trail is probably worth, I don't know, Champawan Trail in Ubud. Oh, sorry, I got this in Arkansas. Okay, this is now one of the most popular ridge lines in Ubud, and this is actually undeveloped. And you wonder why, because it's actually perfect for development. You have essentially a ridge where both sides have rainforest view, both sides have river valley. It would be perfect to actually allow for development and sell this land for what, 30, 40, 50 million dollars probably. But this is actually owned by the royal family of Ubud, and they've managed to essentially say, no, they don't want any more further development on this. And so that also is preserving almost like a national park way of looking at this particular piece of land. Now, That's not to say that there is infrastructure problems in Ubud. If you go there at any given day, you'll see that Ubud is fairly jammed. And if you take a look at, let's say, this particular map, it's not too hard to see why, right? You have this huge density of options around this area, and everybody wants to go to the center of Ubud to experience the town life. All right, so let's get back to the actual question then. Let's summarize. How does over-tourism influence Bali's infrastructure, and how might this influence long-term property investment? I would say this idea of over-tourism is highly dependent on the region. If you look at certain regions, such as, let's say, the popular and fast-growing regions, Seminyak, Canggu, Kuta, yes, this is not very good. You have an imbalance in the number of people coming in versus the amount of infrastructure that's built up for it. But let's say even in the specific example of Seminyak, Kuta, Canggu, Kuta does not have an infrastructure problem anymore. It used to when it was in its heyday and a lot of people were going to Kuta. Kuta has the opposite problem of an infrastructure problem. Kuta has a demand constraint problem. Not enough people are going to Kuta. So in a strange way, that problem in Kuta is resolving itself. You're not having any lack of infrastructure. What you have is a lack of people willing to go there. Now, if Kuta actually retained or even grew the number of guests that went there, that would reduce a lot of the infrastructure problems over here in Canggu, wouldn't it? Because instead of making these long trips on traffic all the way out for 2, 3, 4 hours to get to Puranan and Canggu, people could just go directly from the airport directly to Kuta. So then, boom, infrastructure problem solved, traffic problem solved, and everything would be great. But you can be sure as hell that the people over here in Canggu and Puranan would not want that outcome. So is it actually a lack of infrastructure, or is it imbalance in the way the infrastructure serves? It's probably the second part. Now, let's say we were the government and we were going to try to fix this. The only way to fix it is you probably have to build flyovers and highways, actually, that go over the existing highways already, which is bizarre because how would that even happen, right? It would be very expensive, and essentially they would fly over the existing traffic over to other regions. Now, this as a solution has not been well accepted by the Balinese community. They cite religious examples of how highways cannot be elevated over temples, although I see a lot of other compromises in how the religion is practiced. Somehow that one is not being compromised, but that would be a possible solution to overcome this particular congestion solution here, okay? The other solution is, how can you get more water down over in this particular area? There is no water shortage. The water can be brought all the way from the north to the Bukit area. So the main reason why this is not working is, once again, because of the local politics, okay? End-to-end question. Is there actually an infrastructure problem in Bali? I would dare to say there is not an infrastructure problem. The problem is there's more of a political problem. The politics of each particular region forestall the advancement of projects that everybody already has or already knows a solution to, but it's the sort of the disunified nature of how the island is actually working at this point, such that the common interests are not aligned, and special interests are essentially pulling, let's say, development either this way to deny water or this way to deny growth in Kuta. This is more of the fundamental problem that we're facing here in Bali. All right, this is Jing again from Market Insights, and hopefully this gives a fresh and newer perspective on why we're seeing this particular tax on the infrastructure. And if you agree or don't agree with me, that's fine, but be sure to engage, comment, or follow, and prove that I'm wrong. Tell me something that I don't know and educate me on history. I'm open to have an open conversation to try to ensure that Bali is a more inspirational, more delightful place for one and all. See you next time.